Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Decker-Galicia, and I'm going to be sharing my autoethnography of Just Another Number. This is an autoethnography of my experiences in an occupational total institution being military training. I decided to put my abstract on this page just to show in a very short summary what I'll be covering. I do draw upon Erving Goffman's original work of Asylums, and I do this because he terms total institutions in this book as a very high control environment that is characterized by batch living, high amounts of control, power differentials, and inmate culture. And these are all things that are consistent from one total institution to the next. So I make a lot of parallels that sound a lot like the prison system as well. But of course, here I am talking about military training. I don't disclose my branch of service or locations or any specific names, but I will talk about some of the specific experiences that I went through during this time. The different characteristics of a total institution that I cover that are also termed by Erving Goffman is the integration process, psychological programming, and reintegration into society or release. The integration process, and I will go through all of these more in depth as I go through the PowerPoint. The integration process is very similar to in processing in a correctional facility. So this is where we first come into the fort. A lot of our personal items are taken from us. Our personal clothes are taken off of our bodies. We are given uniforms immediately so we can all have our identities removed and become one. This is a very batch living environment the military is, and I know that that's something that people can see from the outside looking in because of our uniforms. They take our civilian identity and they prepare us for soldiering process, which is when we receive our new soldier identity. If you ask anybody who's been to basic training, it's very likely that they'll say the hardest part was reception, which is this in processing part of training. The second section of training is the psychological programming. And this is when they start to truly transform you from a civilian to a soldier. So they use demoralization, loss of contact from anybody other than in the training institution and inmate culture. They have very strong and evident power differentials between staff and inmates, or in the military's case, drill sergeant and trainees. They do use fear, humiliation, control, and power to gain the obedience from trainees. And inmate culture, you could see it start to grow as the training will progress. And this is because the drill sergeants put a lot of pressure on the trainees, and this causes the trainees to develop their own families and bonds and their own mini society because we didn't have access to the outside world. And the final step is release or reintegration into society. And this occurs only if you successfully complete every part of training. This is when you're released. And it is very difficult to go from being totally controlled to suddenly the next day you have full freedom. And this is when trainees are essentially expected to just regain their identity and be released into society without having any mental health issues. And that's something I do cover in this presentation. The integration process is very, very evident from the moment that you get there. When you get there, you can see how the structure of the forts really, really signify the total control that's going to happen inside of them. And so when we pulled through that gate, I remember thinking that the totality of my decisions were truly, truly showing at that point because there was no turning back at that point. I had made my decision, I had signed the line, and my only way out was through. The first thing that they did was search our items for contraband. So they rummaged through our bags. They did take our cell phones immediately upon entry. They threw away things like scented lotions, conditioners, shampoos, any perfume or makeup was absolutely thrown away. Stuffed animals, anything that signified being a civilian was thrown away, and you could replace it in 2 weeks when you got the chance to go shopping again. And then they start the defacement, and this is something that we all know from basic training as the shaving of the heads. And females did have to go through this, but they have changed regulations to allow us to wear buns. We just have to put our hair up into a bun immediately, even after showering and during bedtime. It cannot be touching our shoulders, it cannot be out of place. It helps us all look as one, and it removes any way that we could express ourselves as individuals. I have to say that the hardest part of reception in the integration process, it was medical and processing. We received several vaccinations and we did go over our DNA, and people who did come to training with wisdom teeth had them removed, regardless if they had enough room in their mouth. It's just something that the military is very serious about. And so that did lead to people being in pain through training. And it was a very hard thing because I remember feeling like livestock as we walked down a very thin hall and received all these vaccines very quickly. And it's something that I cover in depth in my autoethnography. And so this is where the self-mortification process begins, and it does progress throughout the entire reception block. And then you have the main part of programming, and this is where people are soldiered. So during reception, they completely break you down into feeling like nobody, and this continues at the early stages of training. So we have no contact with the outside world. There are very, very obvious power differentials between the trainees and the drill sergeants. Some of the examples were we were always forced to eat outside regardless of the weather. So there were many times that we would have those old-fashioned styrofoam trays and they would just fill with water, but we would still be expected to eat them. And that was just something that we were taught. Humiliation was a very large tool that was used, and mistakes were never met with any understanding. They were met as a tool to humiliate other trainees in front of the public, to be made an example of. That was very common. And we had a very clear idea that we were useless and nothing at this point. We were trainees and we were not to speak up. We were to shut up and listen. And we began receiving this new soldier identity. We began being built back up through weeks of war training. And this is when the inmate culture and some of the trauma bonds began to form and create miniature gangs and animosity between the trainees themselves. So not only did we feel like drill sergeants were a form of our enemies, but we started making enemies within our own kind in a way. And that was very interesting to me. And then finally, there's the reintegration into society. And this is when we were released from training back to our civilian homes. And Erving Goffman explains that this process is very difficult, and it makes you ask yourself, can I make it on the outside? We are rarely the same person that we were before we went into the total institution. I can honestly say that some of the things that happened during my experience in military training have changed me, and they will always change me. I will never be the same person that I was when I entered. And this is just true. And I feel that this is something that we do need to understand is very, very difficult for people to be under total control and then be released into total freedom. And this is why I do raise awareness about trainees understanding this before they make the decision to go to training. And I wrap this up on a discussion of mental health in training itself. It's very common for people to talk about military missions or deployments, and it's a very, very common discussion among military research. But military training isn't really seen as something that is important. Living in a total institution absolutely changes you, no matter if it's occupational or correctional. And all military leadership should understand that it does affect people. The training does affect people, and trainees do need to know the effects of a total institution to better prepare them for training. And my autoethnography covers all of these things in detail. I feel that it truly prepares somebody to go into training without realizing that the psychological effects of a total institution are lasting. And it's something that I wish I would have known before going into the military. And I would love to hear any questions. I would love for you to reach out, and I'd love for you to read my full autoethnography.